Trust your nose. The nose is a very powerful sense, and likely your brain will tell you what to prefer because nowadays a lot of the cannabis that's being produced is being produced primarily for recreational use. Now that's changing slowly, and that's something that I really strongly believe in. That you can change the profile, for example, for athletes who are interested in getting a specific profile in their cannabis product, creating a product, changing the ratios of the cannabinoids to provide that effect, whether it be relaxation, sleep, pain reduction, or whatever.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one fitness resource in Switzerland. On the podcast, I usually interview personal trainers, strength coaches, and gym owners. But on this episode, I have a very special guest for you. This guest is going to shed some light on a topic that's quickly gaining in popularity, and that topic is the use of cannabis in and around sports. Dr. Ricardo Rivera is a faculty member in the Department of Anesthesiology, Pharmacology and Therapeutics at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, as well as a designated cannabinologist and advisor for various leading companies around the world. His passion is to educate the public about cannabis science to help demystify this versatile substance and its many uses. In his free time, Ricardo enjoys running marathons, weight training, and practicing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Ricardo, thanks for coming on the show, man.
It's a pleasure, Sean. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So for people who might not know what it entails, can you tell us a little bit about the life of a cannabis researcher? What does it mean? What does a day look like for you?
Well, it varies a lot depending on the person, but in my case, it involves creating different formulations and discovering different methods and techniques to create cannabis medications. That's my focus, creating new cannabis medicines. So the idea is that, you know, there's a lot of undiscovered potential in the cannabis world, and our job is to put a numerical value to quantify a lot of what this anecdotal, evidence has been so far. And yeah, right now, I mean, I have a lot of different hats. I spend my time at UBC running a lab, dealing with some, co-op students and some of our research colleagues to really identify what the therapeutic efficacy of cannabis cultivars is or different cannabis products is. But then I also advise and help different cannabis companies create new products and new research directions for a a pharmaceutical quality of products. Let's put it that way.
All right. For those who might not know, can you give us a little overview of cannabis? What is it and what does it do to the human brain and the human body?
So it's really interesting because there's so many things that happen. It's actually quite complex, but what people have seen is that overall, first of all, overall cannabis is incredibly safe for people of all types, even for children, right? It's been demonstrated safe for thousands of years. That's why in my line of work, which I'm a pharmacologist, so I deal with drug discovery and development. One of the things that worries the most, that people become the most worried about with creating new drugs, is the safety aspect, right? The toxicological profile. And in the case of cannabis, makes my life a lot easier because it's been shown safe, right? So you can bypass a lot of these tests and hurdles that usually would complicate things. But with regards to the body and the brain, cannabis interacts with a series of receptors known as cannabinoid receptors. There's two that are named cannabinoid receptors and others that cannabis seems to, or the constituents in cannabis seem to interact with. And for the most part, depending upon the compound, you'll have a different profile of effects, but generally, you'll see, some euphoria, some psychotropic effects due to the THC, but then also some relaxation, depending upon the person, anxiolytic properties or like anxiety uh, destroying properties, like reducing anxiety in certain individuals that, for example, have insomnia, help them sleep. It's like a hypnotic to a certain degree. in patients that have, for example, or people that have, for example, um, gastrointestinal issues. Cannabis has been shown to be effective for reducing the inflammation in the GI tract. Um, in the brain, honestly, it's got a wide range of effects. But one thing that I want to highlight, though, is that a lot of the effects that have been shown with cannabis are seem to be, apart from a minor percent of the population that demonstrates maybe unwanted psychological uh, sequelae, or like like schizophrenia, or that it seems to increase the or decrease the time of incident in
Mm.
people that were predisposed to this, the small percentage of the population that this happens to. For the most part, the effects of cannabis are 100% reversible. So, um, you know, some of the maybe side effects or unwanted side effects of using cannabis has been associated with, like, for example, short-term memory reduction, and like a decrease in response, and certain things that are as that are present primarily in individuals who use very infrequently.
Mm.
So if you don't use cannabis at all, you may have this more present. But for those that use more frequently, that there's a significant reduction. And when we go to the sports aspect of it, this will be very, very present and important. But essentially, all these effects that people say that cannabis is bad for your brain, blah, 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 all that is reversible. All these effects are reversible, even in people who have used it long term, like chronically for decades. Like, once you stop using cannabis, you go back to normal.
Okay, so
So
I guess that's an important factor for, again, people that might have thought that, whatever, it can kind of damage you long term. So, like you said before, what do you know the percentage of the population that's, let's say, more prone or inclined to having psychological disorders? I don't know if that's the
I
right term.
I don't know the exact value, but for example, it doesn't really, I mean, and within that population, there's an even smaller percentage of the population that becomes affected by cannabis. And
Mm.
again, it's not that it induces schizophrenia or it induces these things. It's more that it maybe will decrease the incidence, or if people were demonstrating symptoms, it may um, maybe speed things up a little bit.
Okay.
There's still some sort of what's it called? There's still discussions in this field with regards to this. It's
Mm.
not set in stone, but for the general population, there's nothing to worry about with regards to this. Oh, and one other thing too, with regards to cannabis and, for example, the lungs, there's been many studies that have shown that even in patients who consume cigarettes while they consume cannabis. So, we all know that when you consume cigarettes, you have a linear decrease in lung capacity, right?
Mm.
The more you smoke cigarettes, the less lung capacity you have for a bunch of reasons, right? There's inflammation, there's these cancer-causing compounds in cigarette smoke. But even in patients that have used cannabis long-term smoked, there has been no decrease in lung capacity. It's like a linear effect. If you see a graph over the years, it's like it stays linear. And in patients who consume cannabis and tobacco, it seems to help fight against the tobacco's effects, or side effects. So it's again, there's still a lot of work here, but it seems pretty consistent, the data, that cannabis seems to benefit respiratory and again, certain people, respiratory properties, I guess, or preserve the respiratory tract of patients.
Yeah. So for people who would smoke cigarettes and use cannabis as well, it kind of has a mitigating effect on the negative effects
Yeah,
of that cigarette would have on the lungs and the whole respiratory system.
it appears to be so. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So let's jump into cannabis and sports. Why would athletes use cannabis?
So this is really interesting, right? Because there isn't a lot of research directly on the athletes themselves in terms of, let's say, all these physiological properties, but there have been a lot of surveys, and the few studies that have been done on athletes are very illuminating. So I guess should we start with, um, regular athletes or elite athletes? Because
Let's
there's
start with the
two
regular
classes.
athletes because I feel like that's going to be
Okay.
the bulk of the people listening to the
Of
podcast.
course, of course. So this is where it gets a little really interesting, right? There've been a few studies here in this area that have looked at, for example, um, cannabis in sport, and then cannabis on strength and endurance and exercise. And what they've shown is that, and this is, um, there's a lot of issues with the methodologies, because they haven't looked at the really, really high grade cannabis, but you can expect likely something similar in terms of the effects of cannabis smoking or THC, because they've mainly looked at THC or regular cannabis.
Mm,
They've seen, for example, that THC produced a general fall in peak work capacity, and that was dependent upon, again, a lot of factors like uh, use and like how used you are to the cannabis. But overall, in general strength, certain studies didn't. So, okay, let me digress. There's been conflicting data with regards to the studies. There have been some studies that show a very small decrease in peak work capacity
yeah.
and no decrease in strength, and others show a decrease in strength and no decrease in work capacity. So when I say that, is that there's a test that's called and you maybe know about this a little more than me, because I'm not sure exactly how it's conducted, but it's called a um, a finger ergograph. Have you
Okay.
heard about this before?
I have
So
not.
it determines like grip strength, for example.
Okay.
And so they've done these studies where a lot of these studies have been done with stationary bicycles.
Okay.
A lot of these studies are done with stationary bicycles or stair steppers or these sort of like static equipment.
Mm,
And grip measures of strength, such as grip strength, not a lot of like physical barbell strength has been done,
okay.
but a lot of you know endurance and strength with grip and and other metrics that I'm not a sports physiologist, so I'm not the most versed person here to go in depth about this, but I definitely know I can read the science, and so the results have been conflicting. But overall, I just got to say that it's not that significant. So with regards to the cardiorespiratory response, for example, in patients that smoked cigarettes versus cigarettes, with they called cigarettes with cannabis, but joints,
Yeah.
with about 7.5 milligrams of THC, and then a non-smoking control. And they were exercised to about 50% of their VO2 max for 15 minutes. This is like on a stationary bike. One thing that cannabis does or THC does is that it does have a transient increase or short increase in the beats per minute and blood pressure. A slight increase. Actually, it's dose dependent. You can kind of see how much somebody's consumed depending upon how much their baseline heart rate has gone up.
Mm,
But this goes down. And so what the studies uh, showed was that there was a doubling in the increase due to exercise
mm.
from the cannabis smokers. And this is like a transient increase, but in their study, because it was 15 minutes, and usually this increase cost is finishes around 30 minutes, this lasted into the recovery phase, right?
So just to make sure I understand it correctly, people consumed cannabis, then did some light cardiovascular exercise, and what they showed is that their heart rate increase was bigger with cannabis than without.
Yeah, but they redid the study in people who were chronic users, right?
Mm,
And what they saw, in fact, was that in chronic users, even when they began to increase the dose, they showed a fall in their blood pressure.
Mhm.
compared to the control or the baseline when
Okay.
doing exercise. And again, a lot of these results are so minuscule that if you're messing around with statistics, you can say, oh, this is statistically significant, but it
Mhm.
may not be actually clinically or significant in terms of any relevance for us, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
So it's
Science, yeah, yeah.
on paper you can see a little difference, but
Hmm.
in reality, because sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's another, it might actually have no true effect. And
No, like really valuable
Mhm.
consideration for you and I when
Okay.
we're exercising, right?
And so that
Uh,
that study was done, you said, with with cannabis that included THC, right?
exactly. Cannabis with THC, but then also a cannabis preparation, an oil, cannabis oil, was also tested in the second study,
Okay.
just to increase the dose, to be able to increase the dose, because a lot of these studies are government funded, and the U.S. government isn't really very keen on funding, giving people cannabis for this research properly. There's a lot of issues with that. So a lot of this research has to be taken with a grain of salt. There's a lot of studies actually in France that I like to highlight later that are very, very interesting. Um, uh, I laugh at thinking about it because the results are actually quite funny. But regardless, what they've seen. Look, I'll give you a summary of this. What
Yeah.
they've seen is that, and they looked at, and a study looked at 10 healthy males, and they looked at all these parameters. I'll have to read them because there are a lot. They looked at tidal volume, respiratory rate, minute ventilation, oxygen consumption, CO2 production, respiratory exchange ratio, end tidal volume, end tidal PCO2, arterial blood pressure, heart rate, and blood pH, PCO2, and PO2. This is like the concentrations of these gases in the blood. Lactate, carboxyhemoglobin, and what they found after measuring all these things, well, they did find that one subject was too hilariously stoned to keep going doing the exercises, because at this point they were like at a 200 milligrams of THC, so it's like quite high. But he didn't finish. The exercise was supposed to be I believe for 30 minutes, and he finished at like 10 minutes. But
Okay.
the rest, they all finished. They all did. Nothing was different except a higher heart rate compared to control. And they did mention, and this is something that from personally I can attest to. They did mention that the exercise workload felt more difficult, right?
Yeah.
They none of these other values changed, but their psychological perspective and the resting heart, or their heart rate, was higher compared to control, right?
Right.
That's one of the I think one of the best of the studies that have been done in sports, because it was like a continuously, there was a lot of papers with regards to this study, and they kept looking at a different aspect of it. So they were doing with different participants, but overall they kept improving the study and doing various series of studies. So it's a larger body of work, although the subjects were, the amount of people that were tested was relatively low,
Mhm.
right? Because it's not the easiest thing to do, honestly. But they've also looked at exercise in industrial setting. So this was funny too, because this one is a larger group of people. This was 300 mill workers, steel mill workers in Wisconsin, in
Yeah.
Milwaukee. And they wanted to find out, the idea is like, will cannabis, or would cannabis affect people that are doing, physically intense jobs, like working in a steel mill, right? And they took those 300 people and they split them up into four groups. Those that would use cigarettes, those that use cannabis alone, cigarettes with cannabis, or nothing. And what they saw was, again, this was an exercise that was done on a stationary bike until voluntary exhaustion. So how long could you do this for?
Mhm.
And apart from higher minute ventilation in the smokers, and a perceived higher exertion rate, like they seemed like they were doing more exercise,
Mm.
there was no difference among any of the groups. All right, no difference at all, no significant difference. So
Okay.
again, I mean that tells you that you can do that. You can be in a steel mill and you can be high. I mean, maybe that's not maybe that's not what I should be saying actually. I don't want this to be misinterpreted. But essentially, it doesn't seem like cannabis would affect you in any significant way, whether you're in a as a regular athlete training in maybe an indoor gym or in under heavy workload in a steel mill, right?
Right. So a recreational athlete, somebody who's not necessarily taking part in any type of competition, what cannabis might do is it might make your workout feel a little bit harder, and it
Mhm.
might make your heart rate go up a little bit more than it would if you weren't smoking. But then, other than that, in terms of performance and output, nothing changes.
Very little. Again, there's a like as you know, there's a huge mental component to fitness and exercise and sport. So we can't really speak. I can't really speak to that aspect of it. Although in elite athletes, there's been some very interesting results that have come from that. But
Yeah.
one thing I like to highlight, though, one thing I would really like to highlight is that they've done studies looking at um, exercise-induced asthma, right? This is something that happens in certain. I've had this happen to me once, actually. Running on a really long distance like run, I started feeling constriction in my throat, and it could have been from a bunch of different things. But uh, but this is something that happens to a certain population that they begin to not be able to breathe, and they get what's called exercise-induced asthma, right? And what they found was that they did these studies on athletes with this problem. They found that cannabis with THC and THC alone seemed to produce a significant reduction in the exercise and the incidences of exercise induced asthma, and also this was comparable to you know the the inhaled medications like the puffer
Mhm.
that people take. um
Okay, so THC might have similar effects to puffers that people take for asthma or exercise-induced asthma.
for specifically for exercise induced asthma. Now, again, this study hasn't been replicated, but I just wanted to highlight that because it was really interesting. I saw the result and I was like, well, it's pretty fascinating.
All right. So now that we're talking more about athletes, I think it's important to highlight that the WADA, so the World Anti-Doping Agency, has included cannabis on their prohibited list, saying that it's a performance-enhancing drug, a potential health risk, and a violation of the spirit of sport. More specifically, they say that all natural and synthetic cannabinoids are prohibited, and that's in cannabis and cannabis products, natural and synthetic tetrahydrocannabinols, so THCs, and synthetic cannabinoids that mimic the effects of THCs, but not CBD. So CBD is not actually on the prohibited substance list. And WADA, so it's the World Anti-Doping Agency, and most sporting organizations around the world follow their regulations, except for a few like the NBA, the NFL, and others have kind of their own interpretation of what's allowed and what's not, or their testing protocols might not reflect ones that WADA want to see all the time. For example, if I'm not mistaken, the NFL only tests once during the off season, and then the rest of the year they don't necessarily. And same in the NBA, cannabis is allowed in the off season, not in season, but off season is fine. So I think it's important to state. I mean, here in Switzerland, for example, you can buy cannabis products in shops, but THC values are going to be 1% or below. They can't have any more concentration than that. And so THC being on the prohibited substance list, it's important to highlight for athletes that are competing in a sport that might be tested at some point that consuming anything with THC might be problematic. Can you talk about the detection, let's say the half-life, but how long can THC be detected when you're tested as a person or as an athlete?
So I'm not sure if you're aware of this actually, but there's an interesting history between WADA and cannabis. So WADA um, banned cannabis in 2004. You know that, right? And you
Okay.
know why? So it was assumed it wasn't usable, but in turn of the 20th century, more people began to use cannabis when they introduced snowboarding into Olympic sports. The first gold medal was won by a Canadian called Ross Regalbagliati. I can't say his last name properly, but Ross Regalbagliati, whatever. The point is that he won the gold, and then he got tested, and he came out positive for cannabis at a rather low level, but he tested positive for that. And so they tried to strip his medal. But he fought back, saying that there was nothing on the regulations that said he could not um, you know, use cannabis. And it's true. There wasn't nothing in the regulations that said he couldn't use cannabis. And so they returned the medal. There was this big hubbub. And then WADA put it officially in 2004 into their ban list. But
It
they
wasn't banned until 2004.
officially, yes.
Okay.
And more interestingly enough, they've had to consistently revise the detection levels because, cannabis doesn't follow the same, let's say, pharmacokinetics as other drugs. What happens often with cannabis is that cannabis becomes stored in the body's fat cells, and it doesn't become active. It's not that it's active, but it's stored. And so when you burn fat, you release this free THC that then gets detected. So the levels used to be a lot lower. Now the detection levels for THC. So they're actually detecting this analyte called carboxy THC, and that's the metabolite that gets that THC becomes in the human body, and it's measured in the urine. So when you give a urine test as an athlete, then that's one of the things that they measure. But the limit is 180, I believe, 180 nanograms per mil, because again, it's not. Another thing that I'm not sure if you know is that it's not illegal to use cannabis when you're training. It's illegal to use cannabis during competition. And so that is the limit by which they say, okay, you've been using cannabis. If you ever use cannabis during the off time, and you haven't cleared it completely, then this is the limit that they can say, okay, you've been using it during, the competition time or a tournament or whatever. But in the body, it's interesting as well because it's highly dependent upon the amount of fat you have and your metabolism. And athletes, especially elite athletes, they have very low body fat. They're very active, so the amount of time it takes for them to clear cannabis is likely very low. Um, I've done tests in different groups, and the average, I would say, is about 15 days for somebody who's maybe normal body composition. Like, define normal, of course, there's nothing normal, but um, someone who's not super skinny and that's not super active.
So maybe
Now,
in the 20 to 25 for men, something like that.
yeah, something like that, exactly. And somebody who's maybe uh, 5 to 10% body fat, and it's very active, it could be 9 days and below, or even sometimes much less, that you can
Mhm.
clear any detectable uh, analytes from the body, right?
Okay.
But
And
yeah,
what about blood levels?
so that changes a lot quicker. I don't have a precise value for that, but that in the first few days, you'll have something detectable, but then it becomes stored in the fat. So
Mm.
unless of course you exercise, they've had to revise these values consistently because there've been studies that have shown that even, like, for example, after using cannabis, you become undetectable. If you then suddenly exercise intensely and you burn a lot of fat, you can then get levels that are high enough to detect it again. To be like, people are like, "Oh, you've been using cannabis?" No, I haven't been using anything. So that's why they've revised these values.
Okay, so essentially the detectable THC values in the body can change over time depending on your activity level.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Oh, okay.
And a lot more things that people don't understand about this, but that's why it's been so hard to create um, a reliable field test for like cops or police officers to use on people to tell if they've been, consuming cannabis while driving, because there's all these factors. It doesn't follow the typical profile of a conventional drug, let's say like cocaine or opioids, for example.
Mhm. So for athletes that might be, using THC, what would you, or cannabis in general, what would you recommend if they might be tested at some point? Um, what kind of margin would you give yourself to make sure that you don't get tested positive in the case of a competition?
So again, I think it depends on what level you are. If you're an if you're like, I don't know, college level, I guess I would call you elite as well. Um, I would give it about 15 days to be 100% sure. Now, you can get away with it probably at 10 days. If you're a woman, likely would require a little bit more time, just because there's an increase in body fat. And there's in women, there is a slight difference with regards to not only the effect or the amount of THC they need to get an effect, and also the distribution in the body. But
Mhm.
overall, reliably, probably like 15 days from use. So if, your competition is at this moment, sort of measure 15 days before. But then you can also use, and this is for people who get tested by these, advanced facilities. If you get tested by a conventional, more maybe not so rigorous test, I wouldn't worry about after 9 or 10 days. But a more conventional, like more legitimate and complex assay that Olympic athletes get, then I would say probably 15 days prior to competition.
So when people say that cannabis can be detected in the blood or in the urine 3 to 4 months after use, that's actually not true.
That is, it's not that it's not true, and not that it's like it hasn't happened before, but it's very rare, and
Okay.
it's only this tends to happen only in individuals who are, you know have large amounts of body fat and are very sedentary. Um, it's very rare for that to happen, even in regular sedentary folks, right? Usually, at most, by the end of the month, you should be clear, and likely much sooner.
Okay, and then to switch gears a little bit, we talked about, I guess, cannabis as a whole, so cannabis including THC. So if we talk about now CBD a little bit more specifically, has there been any research done on CBD and physical activity, or CBD alone and sports performance?
So there hasn't been so much studies looking at CBD in sports or training aspects of it. At least none that are legitimate. But there have been studies on with CBD, or they've been starting to do studies with CBD and the effects of certain sports. For example, American football. And there's this worry, right, that these high impact sports lead to what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is like swelling of the brain, like these frequent concussions lead to brain damage. And so there's this real interest in seeing how the CBD seems to potentially have the potential to either reduce the inflammation during the event, or act as a preventative measure for when if that event would occur, to improve the outcome, right? There's a lot of research here, but there's issues with delivery, because cannabinoids in general, including CBD, are very fatty. They're fat soluble. They're essentially oils, right? And so what happens is that if you take an oil directly, you'll absorb a bit of it, but most of it will be excreted unchanged. You won't be able to metabolize a large percentage of it. So you need to have it in a water soluble form. And that's what one of the things that I'm working with right now, is trying to create a better delivery method for these cannabinoids in a water soluble manner, so that you can get much higher concentrations, the concentrations that have been shown to be really effective for this like anti-inflammatory effects and so on, to be able to be administered in a way that can get to a person's brain or whatever organ you'd be interested in exploring, right? In general, what I would say is that there's only a few disease indications or things that CBD has been shown to be effective for, uh, and they're still discovering more. But athletes who use CBD preventatively, you know, you don't get it won't hurt you. It won't hurt you at all, but you may not get any significant benefit from it. Like
And
it's
so that's from the performance standpoint. Is there anything that's been done in terms of research talking about recovery, pain management, and those aspects that might be interesting for sport people and athletes?
so not for CBD specifically, but there are things that have been explored with regards to cannabis, and elite athletes, for example, um, which we can get into. Um, if you're interested in going down this avenue, there is a lot of really this is the nascent. We're just starting to discover all these things now with regards to cannabis in sports. It's just starting. If any of like the viewers or listeners out there are interested in going into a field that has a lot of potential, it's cannabis and cannabinoid products in sports, because there is the inklings and the start of something very potentially valuable, but the data isn't there yet. So we need to do more of these studies. But overall, we know that cannabis has a lot of benefits anecdotally, and that's the some of the performance enhancement that people have been taking. For example, cannabis with THC and CBD, because it's all the important thing to keep in mind is that sadly, CBD by itself or THC by itself isn't as effective as both of these things together. And in cannabis specifically, the whole is greater much more than the parts. Like the different cannabinoids playing together have much more therapeutic effects and effects of all types than separately. And they've been working on, so a lot of the people, this is research that I've done, research that others have done, and sort of conclude the same thing. It all depends on the ratio. So for example, you can change the effect profile of cannabis or a cannabis product by changing the ratio of, for example, THC to CBD or CBD to THC, or now other cannabinoids that are being explored, right? And for example, in the case of pain reduction, cannabis seems to be very effective. There's a reason why a lot of surfers and hockey players use cannabis. So they've done these very broad surveys of all these NCAA athletes and all these elite athletes around the world. And what they found is that it's such kind of funny, but um, there's certain groups. Obviously, if you're from a country that supports cannabis, you're gonna might probably use cannabis more than a country that doesn't.
Yeah.
But there's certain groups within certain sports that seem to have a higher prevalence of cannabis use. And that's, for example, uh, sliding sports like skiers, bobsledders, skeleton, like
Hmm.
these sort of sports. And I'm not sure what that has to say about the sport, but I mean, and also hockey players and surfers. Hockey players and surfers use cannabis quite a bit. And there's theories behind this is because cannabis, for example, or THC in cannabis does increase the pressure thresholds. So when you have pressure on specific spots of your body, cannabis, and again, I'll use cannabis and THC interchangeably because it's the whole, I'm saying like it's all the cannabinoids together, but primarily THC is present. It's cannabis increases the endurance to these specific pressure points, as in the case of some of these different sports that I previously mentioned, right?
Hmm.
It increases the tolerance to that, right? Um, and so if you're doing a contact sport or a sport that has these aspects involved in it, then cannabis could likely help you in terms of performance for this. But in addition to that, the vast majority of the athletes who use cannabis say the same thing. They say that I enjoy using cannabis as a way to help me relax, one, before a competition or, during training, or, I'm getting stressed for something, and to help sleep. So these are aspects that I think in sport are often maybe not taken into account or disregarded, but there's a lot of value in being able to relax prior to a competition or a moment you have to, have a significant output, especially if you're a professional, right? To be able to clear your mind and do what you need to do, and to be able to sleep prior to one of these competitions, right?
How do you balance that out with, for example, how do you balance that those potential benefits of stress reduction in a competition setting with the psychotropic effects of THC and what that could do and how that could influence your decision making in, let's say, a contact sport where maybe if you're not quote unquote all there, it might
Mhm.
be actually more dangerous for you.
That's true. And I think it has to do a lot of it with use. So if you're a chronic user or frequent user, likely these mind altering effects in terms of a lot of this, you always maybe will get high to a certain degree, uh, quote unquote, but you won't get these significant aspects of memory impairment or judgment that are sometimes associated with cannabis the more you use. I mean, frequent cannabis users know that sometimes they behave, I mean, there's no change. I mean, they smoke, they feel better, or they use the cannabis in some way, they feel better, they get whatever uh, symptom relief they need or looking for, and they can work and they can, run and they can play and they can do everything they usually do without any significant alteration to their abilities, right?
Mm.
Um, and the more you get used to it, the higher the chance of that occurring. But with the occurrence of these really high um, concentration cannabis strains and cannabis products, what I would suggest is CBD plays a big role in reducing the unwanted side effects of THC. So CBD counteracts a lot of the anxiety inducing, or like a lot of the side effects that we discussed that people don't want, like paranoia, anxiety from high THC concentrations, a lot of the intense maybe mood changes that occur with THC. And CBD balances that out. So if you can get something that's maybe either higher in CBD than THC or somewhat similar,
Mm.
you're likely going to get a more favorable uh, profile if you're doing a sport or
Mm.
trying to do. And again, this is really specific to a specific person's sort of use or how they like to use cannabis or what they're used to, or you know some people tolerate cannabis really well, some people don't tolerate cannabis at all. So it's just like everything in life, there's people that this will benefit, there's people that it won't benefit, but in people that it does benefit, it seems to really benefit, like legitimately benefit a bunch of things in their lives.
So it's, yeah. Now I see the complexity because we talk about different reaction profiles to the compounds themselves depending on who we're talking about, and then we're talking about different concentration levels: THC, CBD, other cannabinoids and compounds and chemicals within cannabis. So essentially, you can't really know exactly how you're going to react to what until you try it. Is that kind of where we're at?
Pretty much. Yeah, that's the same thing I tell people when I'm not advocating the use of cannabis or anything like that, but people that have asked me, "Oh, what cannabis should I use?" I always tell them, "Look, trust your nose. The nose is a very powerful sense, and likely your brain will tell you what to prefer because nowadays a lot of the cannabis that's being produced is being produced primarily for recreational use. Now that's changing slowly, and that's something that I really strongly believe in, that you can change the profile. For example, for athletes who are interested in getting a specific profile in their cannabis product, creating a product, changing the ratios of the cannabinoids to provide that effect, whether it be relaxation, sleep, pain reduction, or whatever, right? Um, but currently in the market, that's something that's not as available or prevalent. Or people aren't going to be that aware of it. People are going to be selling you these products are not going to be that aware of that aspect of it. Um, but in general, it's this is anecdotal, but there's been in certain island countries that have a preference for cannabis, the local cannabis products are typically the ones that they prefer consuming because likely it has a profile, a cannabinoid profile that fits for them, that fits their needs, maybe more diverse, especially ones that are grown, that have been grown for decades, like these land races that are found in Jamaica, for example, have a more favorable cannabinoid profile that isn't super intense or super euphoric, because that's often not what you want when you're going to compete in a sport. In my case, I typically avoid using cannabis when I'm doing exercise or sport because I find that I don't have the same output or focus. I feel good for a limited amount of time, like I can maybe run a 5K without any problems. But if I'm running longer distances, then my mind starts eating it myself. You know, you get that like hamster wheel turning, and you start thinking things that you shouldn't be thinking, and it
Mhm.
kind of distracts you from what you should be doing.
So less control on your thoughts, maybe.
Yeah, or yeah, it's like you're just not interested. It just makes you focus on things you're not interested in, or maybe there is a time dilation aspect of cannabis that maybe it's not that great when you're running and you just want it to go get you just want to finish, you know.
Yeah.
I don't want to make this any longer. But but that's different for different people, and I know contact sport athletes in terms of like you know, jujitsu fighters or MMA fighters that consume cannabis during competitions, or every time they train, you know. So it's really dependent upon the person, I think, as well. As there's all these properties that are beneficial, but you know, there's a certain time and place for everything.
Yeah. So again, for those listening, I think it's important to say it again that THC is on the prohibited list from WADA, and if you are being tested in competition setting, you want to make sure that you're not putting yourself at risk by using close to or during competition, especially if it's cannabis that contains THC.
One thing I like to add though is that I've read the WADA sort of angle on this, and it's primarily because it goes against the spirit of sport, whatever the heck that means. Like in terms of cannabis, you know, does not really it's not detrimental to you. I mean, that's been known for a long time, or significantly detrimental to especially athletes. It's not going to give you, you know, it's not like an anabolic steroid at all. So so the angle that they're going with is just it's something that has been illegal for a long time. You know, humans, and it was only made illegal officially in 1930s, right? By first the US, and then they pushed it on the rest of the world. So it's sort of a more conservative mentality for why it's been made uh, you know, illegal, or why it's been banned for athletes. But that's changing slowly. The Like you mentioned before, the NFL's Players Association and the league in general is separate from these WADA guidelines, and they've recently, I believe, um, they're now, I'm not sure if completely permitting players to use, but they're not fining them or giving them you know, serious uh, punishments if they test positive for cannabis, because the players association has been fighting hard, saying there's all these medicinal aspects to cannabis. You can't, ban this if sometimes players need this, especially now that we see, all these effects that happen after long-term contact, long-term head injuries, which cannabis seems to ameliorate. So
So, do you think that in coming years, maybe decades, those laws might change to the point where cannabis is fully accepted within the realm of sports?
I think it should turn to the same way as alcohol, right? Um, I'm not 100% sure on the regulations for alcohol. I believe you can't be drinking while you're doing the competition.
No.
Uh, so if you have a certain level of alcohol concentration, that is it'll complicate you. But I think it'll be very similarly. The only sad thing is that, well, cannabis lasts in your body longer than alcohol, right? But they'll revise things to the point where it'll be somewhat similar, where you're not going to punish uh, players or athletes who are using in their off time or when they're training by themselves, you know, because you don't want people, I guess, during a specific sport to not to have any sort of mind altering properties, but there is the aspect of being there when you're competing
Mm.
at your highest level at naturally, right? And I think there'll be revisions with regards to the regulations to permit that to occur, to permit you to be able to use cannabis if you need to, up until the point of competition.
All right. So now let's talk a little bit about safe use guidelines for people that already use it or might consider using it with or around sports. What would you, as a professional, what would you recommend?
So if you're doing a sport, likely you're going to want to avoid smoking the cannabis product. Again, there hasn't been a lot of effect demonstrated by the smoking process, but just it's likely not good to smoke anything if you're going to, for example, going to go running or going to do any specific sport that requires significant cardiovascular output.
Mm.
So maybe use a vaporizer or use an edible. And if you use cannabis already, then you likely know where your levels lie. But if you don't and you're getting used to it, you know, the saying start low and go slow is very pertinent because you definitely want to test yourself, especially when you're uh, becoming more tired and your capacities are maybe a little bit lessened after uh, I keep using running as an example because that's the one I have the most sort of association with. But any sort of sport, right? Even if you're doing jujitsu, I know a lot of people that do jujitsu. They smoke and go do jujitsu, and I'm not at that point yet. Maybe they're supremely confident in their abilities, and that helps them somehow. But to myself, I feel like, oh man, I'd be a little bit panicky if I have a 200-pound guy on top of me and I'm like stoned. but but to each his own. I think, and regardless, the best thing to do is if you're an athlete to use a vaporizer. If you enjoy, because there's people say, okay, an edible that takes a lot of time to have an effect, and there's other ways like oils and stuff, but those have the same properties as generally edibles. I'd recommend a lot of people that would like to use cannabis and their athletes to, you know, use cannabis after the fact, do the sport, do the exercise or training, and then if you want to use cannabis, use it after the fact. Um, that way, you can, you know, get the most of that exercise training because, there is that aspect of in certain people it seems to, reduce a little bit their peak work output. So if you want to do maximal training, you likely would want to avoid using cannabis. And if you want to have maximal strength, well, um, it may just affect your mind, but your mind is a very powerful part of sport. So,
Great. Is there anything you'd like to add around cannabis and sports for people listening today?
what's funny? So they did this study in the US. It's interesting how much the local customs and ideas with regards to things affect science or a scientific publication or research. Scientists are, although science should be blind and unbiased, scientists are not. They're affected by their environment and the society. And so you see, for example, there was a study that was done in the US looking at regular people, not elite athletes, and their prevalence in the population, their prevalence for doing exercise and sports. And they compared that with people who used cannabis within that population. And they found that there was a small, very small percentage decrease in the amount of exercise that regular cannabis users do versus people who don't use cannabis, like super small. And that was the US study, which was funded by, those agencies in the US. There was a study done in France and Switzerland that looked in like your area actually, that looked at teenagers from I believe 17 to about 20 something, a relatively large cohort of male athletes, and they found that in fact there was a in these people there was a significant reduction in alcohol consumption, but an increase use in cannabis in athletes overall versus the general population. So, I mean, that's something to chew on, maybe to think about. But I find it fascinating because once again, there's not a lot of focus on the effects of legal drugs like alcohol and tobacco on the effects that they have on the general population. Uh, but there does seem to be this view out of all these things available, cannabis out of the maybe conventional recreational compounds out there. I think people have this view. People that are aware have a view that it is actually beneficial or less less damaging. No, I don't want to use the word damaging. Just less has less of an effect overall on your health. And if you're an athlete and you want to consume something that's gonna, we all want to change our perspective somehow. And there's a lot of really good things that cannabis does offer for certain people. It's better to choose that than go with tobacco or alcohol. And so I think it's interesting that study. And there have been similar studies like that have shown that, in fact, people who consume cannabis, and maybe this is a European thing, I don't know, are actually doing more sports and more exercise than people who aren't. Now, again, I just put that out there for you guys to interpret the way you want, and you can read the study if you want. But I just found that very interesting.
Well, maybe it's a good place to finish off and leave that as an open-ended kind of question for people to reflect on and think about. Ricardo, where can people find out more about you and what you do?
So I have a podcast actually focusing on this called the Cannabis Science Podcast. And that's in English. I'm starting one in Spanish called Cannabis Conciencia for those that speak Spanish. You're going to have a Spanish language podcast about cannabis science. And I have a website called cannabisconciencia.org, or you can look me up on Twitter at CannaSciencePod, and find me in all the regular, like Google my name, Ricardo Rivera Acevedo, and I'm sure you'll find something interesting.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Sean. Take care, man.
Take care.